On my graduation day, I stood outside the auditorium for hours, clutching my cap and my diploma. Not a single member of my family showed up. They had deliberately gone on vacation together without even telling me. That same night, I deleted their numbers, moved to another city, and legally changed my name. After that humiliation, I swore I would never look back. I had no idea that decision wouldn't just change my life. It would save it. Before I dive in, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe so this channel can keep growing and bringing you more stories like this one. The sky above the university looked heavy and gray, as if it shared the same weight pressing down on my chest. The courtyard outside the multi-purpose hall buzzed with laughter, squeals of joy, and the constant click of cameras. Everywhere I looked, graduates were wrapped in their parents' arms. There were bouquets of flowers, bright balloons bobbing in the wind, the smell of expensive perfume mixed with sweat and slightly wilted roses. I stood stiffly near a concrete pillar, a map-like tube holding my honors diploma in one hand, the other gripping the hem of my cheap rented gown until it wrinkled. I had been standing there for 4 hours. My feet were numb inside the bargain high heels I'd bought for the occasion, and the makeup I'd carefully done myself at dawn was probably melting in the humid air. Still, I didn't dare move far. I was terrified my family would arrive, not see me, and leave again. I'd sent them my live location in the family group chat before sunrise. I had called my dad, my stepmother Susan, and my older brother Luke over and over. No one picked up. My messages sat there unread, frozen on double gray ticks, or, worse, a single lonely checkmark. I kept refreshing the screen as if I could force them to care. A classmate with mediocre grades squealed nearby as her father handed her an enormous bouquet of money folded into roses. He kissed her forehead with pride while her mother fussed with her cap so the tassel sat just right for photos. Watching them felt like having glass slowly pushed under my fingernails. I remembered begging my dad to pay my last semester's tuition. I remembered shelving books in the campus library every evening, saving every coin to afford the graduation fee. I wasn't asking for a car or a stack of cash. I just wanted them to be there, to stand beside me and smile for a photo so I could pretend, for one day, that I belonged in the Carter family. A light drizzle started, and people scrambled for umbrellas or hurried toward the parking lot. I stepped back under the awning but kept my eyes locked on the main gate, inventing excuses for them in my head. Traffic is horrible on graduation days, I told myself. Maybe the car broke down. Maybe Susan took too long getting ready, and they're just late. I kept building excuses on top of excuses, anything to drown out the small voice in my chest whispering the truth. They weren't coming. By 2 in the afternoon, the ceremony had been over for hours. The courtyard was almost empty except for cleaners sweeping plastic cups and crushed petals. My stomach growled loudly. I hadn't eaten since the night before, too nervous and excited about the day I thought would finally change everything. I pulled out my cracked phone, more out of habit than hope. As I opened social media, my heart stuttered. Luke's profile photo glowed with a red circle. He'd posted a story 5 minutes earlier. My fingers shook as I tapped it. Bright sunlight flooded the screen. Luke grinned, a cocktail in his hand, waves crashing behind him on white sand. The camera panned to show Susan in a wide-brimmed beach hat and oversized sunglasses, laughing hard, and my dad stretched out on a lounge chair while someone massaged his shoulders. "Family vacation in Bali. Finally free of boring events," Luke shouted cheerfully over the sound of the surf. The story ended with their glasses clinking together. My world collapsed so completely that even the roar of the growing rain faded. They weren't stuck in traffic. They hadn't forgotten. They had planned a trip on my graduation day and left without even bothering to lie about it. My biggest achievement was, to them, a boring event to escape. They looked happier in that video than I'd seen them in years. Not a flicker of guilt in their faces. If anything, they looked relieved. I didn't cry. Something colder slid into the space where my hope had been. I felt something die inside me. My need for their approval. My childish belief that if I worked hard enough, they'd love me. I memorized every frame of their joy over my pain and swore, silently, that it was the last time I would ever wait for them. I took off my cap, the square of cardboard suddenly ridiculous in my hands, and walked to an overflowing trash can. I dropped it in without ceremony. Then I peeled off the black gown and tossed it after the cap, standing there in the simple dress I'd sewn myself. I pulled my diploma from its tube, folded it carefully, and slipped it into my bag. The empty tube went into the trash as well. I didn't need symbols anymore. I didn't need to prove anything to people who had already decided I didn't matter. Head held higher than I felt, I walked out into the now pouring rain, not bothering to shield my face as makeup and mascara streaked down my cheeks. By the time I reached the bus stop, I was soaked through, but I barely felt it. On the bus, I slid my SIM card out of my phone, snapped the tiny piece of plastic in half, and let the broken pieces fall to the floor. Then I deleted every social media app, every contact with my family's names attached to it, one after another like cutting thin threads. An hour later, shivering and exhausted, I stood inside the bright, echoing main train station in the city center. Noise bounced off the high ceiling, announcements, crying children, vendors shouting, but it all sounded far away. I walked to the ticket counter and said, "1 ticket on the next train to the farthest big city you've got." The clerk gave my damp clothes a strange look, but he printed the ticket anyway. I paid in cash, slid it into my pocket, and sat down in the crowded waiting area. A giant TV hung on the wall above us, playing the evening news. I stared at it without really seeing until the bright breaking news banner flashed in red. The anchor's voice turned grave as footage filled the screen. Flames devouring a 2-story house, firefighters struggling to control the blaze. My heart stopped. It was my house, the Carter house. The reporter said the fire was believed to be caused by faulty wiring. Neighbors had told them the whole family was away on vacation, but their daughter, the one who was supposed to be coming home from graduation, was probably inside. They believed she had been trapped in her upstairs bedroom when the floor collapsed. No one had seen her leave in the family car. I sat frozen, staring at my life burning on the screen. If I had gone home like a good daughter, if I had curled up on my bed to cry and sleep off the day, I would have been cooked alive. The thought was so absurdly cruel that the corner of my mouth twitched upward. A bitter, incredulous smile spread across my face. The universe was either playing a twisted joke on me or giving me a way out. My family was sipping cocktails in Bali, convinced I was at home. The whole world now thought Rachel Carter had died in a tragic fire. I realized I had just been handed the escape hatch I'd always dreamed of. I didn't have to run. I was already dead to them. When my train pulled into the platform with a long screaming whistle, I stood, clutched my bag, and stepped onto it as someone else entirely. The city that swallowed me the next morning was enormous, dirty, and anonymous. High-rises and exhaust fumes. People who didn't look twice at the drenched girl with the haunted eyes dragging a cheap suitcase. That anonymity felt like safety. I found a tiny room at the back of a crumbling boarding house near the station, a thin mattress on a concrete floor, peeling paint, a fan that rattled so loudly it sounded like it might fly apart. The landlady barely looked up as I counted out cash from my last savings. "Name?" she asked. I hesitated for the briefest second, then said, "Safia." I tasted the new name on my tongue. Rachel Carter had died in that fire. Safia was the one standing here now, trying to stitch a future together from ashes. The first months were the hardest. I ate instant noodles twice a day and drank boiled tap water. I took any bookkeeping or data entry job I could find that didn't ask too many questions about my background. At night, when the boarding house grew hot and suffocating, I walked to a cramped internet cafe at the end of the street, pulled a cap low over my face, and rented an hour at a dusty computer. My hands shook the first time I typed my own name into the search bar. News articles flooded the screen. Photos of the burned-out skeleton of our house, solemn anchors talking about the tragedy, and then, buried under the initial shock, I found a video thumbnail that made my blood turn to ice. It was a press conference. My family had already returned from Bali. They stood in front of a row of microphones dressed in black, faces arranged into masks of grief. Susan sobbed theatrically, clutching a framed photo of me to her chest like a prop. She said, between perfectly timed sobs, that she regretted not being home that day, that she had been out of town for a medical appointment, not on vacation. The lie slid off her tongue so smoothly you could almost believe she'd convinced herself. My father, Mr. Carter, spoke with sad, measured dignity, asking the public for prayers for my soul. He announced the creation of a charity in my name to help fire victims. Social media comments were full of sympathy. Donations poured in, watching them, perfectly composed in their sorrow, selling my supposed death for applause and money, something inside me snapped. At first, I thought the fire might truly have been an accident, but the timing nagged at me. How convenient that our house went up in flames on the exact afternoon I should have been home, exhausted from my ceremony. How convenient that the insurance paid out so quickly that the charity and the miraculous turnaround of my father's failing company followed so close behind. I remembered that my father liked to brag about how secure and modern his digital systems were, how everything important was backed up in the cloud. When I was younger, he used to make me help with his office files, teaching me passwords he said I should never repeat. Old habit and anger became fuel. At the cafe, I opened a private browser window and tried to log into his cloud account. The first password I typed, one I remembered from high school, failed. My pulse pounded. He'd changed it. I closed my eyes for a moment, thinking like him. My father cared about two things, money and control. I tried the date his company landed its first huge contract, denied. I tried Luke's birthday, out of spite, denied. Then a memory surfaced, the smug smile on my father's face when he had joked about never forgetting a password as long as he remembered his favorite mistress's birthday. Disgust twisted my stomach, but my fingers typed the numbers anyway. This time, the screen flickered and opened. Folders bloomed across the desktop, financial reports, legal documents, personal notes. My breathing slowed as I clicked deeper into the labyrinth of his secrets. A folder named Insurance R caught my eye. Inside was a life insurance policy with my name on it, updated just 6 months before the fire. The payout was enormous, enough to pull a drowning company back to the surface and then some. The policy specifically covered accidental death in household incidents, including fire. In another hidden folder, I found financial statements showing Carter Corp on the brink of collapse before my death, then miraculously resurrected afterward. Finally, I stumbled on a string of emails between my father and a man whose name kept appearing in crime reports as I searched. A small-time thug turned arsonist for hire. They discussed cleaning the site, making sure it looked like faulty wiring, and timing it while we're out of town. The last email was dated 1 week before my graduation. I stumbled back from the screen, one hand clamped over my mouth as if I could hold the nausea down. My family hadn't just abandoned me at my graduation. They had planned to kill me. I wasn't a disappointment or an afterthought. I was an asset, a line item. The daughter raised just well enough to graduate with honors, insured for millions, then scheduled to be burned for cash. The fact that I was alive was nothing but an accident, a glitch in their plan caused by their own cruelty in not showing up. I sank into the chair, shaking, and let the truth carve itself into my bones. I had always thought I simply wasn't loved. Instead, I had been livestock they once intended to slaughter. That night, I didn't go straight back to the boarding house. I walked the city aimlessly until my cheap flats rubbed my heels raw. At one point, I caught my reflection in a shop window. A thin, tired girl in a soaked dress, shoulders caved in, eyes too big for her face. Rachel, the obedient daughter who begged for scraps of affection, really did deserve to die, if not in flames, then in the sense that she could no longer exist. I stared at that reflection and whispered to myself that Safia would be different. I wouldn't just survive. I would grow teeth. I would become someone powerful enough to stand in front of them one day, not as their daughter, but as their reckoning. From then on, my life narrowed to a sharp point. I used the only weapon I had, my mind. I took every small bookkeeping job I could find, not at big firms that would dig into my past, but at scrappy little businesses that needed someone fast and didn't ask many questions. I worked long days, saved every penny, and spent my nights studying. I devoured secondhand law and business textbooks, learning about corporate fraud, insurance law, and financial forensics. I watched videos on how auditors thought, how investigators traced dirty money. I cut my hair, started wearing a simple hijab and thick-framed glasses, partly as a disguise, partly as armor. I trained my voice to be calm and firm instead of apologetic. On the peeling wall of my tiny room, I pinned every article I could find about the Carter family's miraculous comeback. Year after year, I watched my father transform in the media from a failing businessman to a resilient visionary who had turned tragedy into inspiration. Susan became a philanthropist, praised for her charity in my name. Luke, who could barely balance his own bank account, was made CFO of Carter Corp. They smiled from glossy magazine covers, while journalists called them proof that love and hard work conquer fate. Sometimes, alone at night, I would stand in front of that wall of clippings, tracing their faces with my eyes. I didn't fantasize about killing them. That would have been too simple, too merciful. I imagined something else. Their empire crumbling, their reputations burned, the world seeing them for what they really were. For that, I needed more than anger. I needed position, power, and patience. 5 years later, I looked into a very different mirror. There was no trace of the soaking wet graduate abandoned outside a hall. In her place was a young woman in a tailored blazer and a silk hijab, standing in the bedroom of a sleek apartment with a view of the city's financial district. I had climbed slowly but relentlessly, taking junior roles, then bigger ones, never staying anywhere long enough for anyone to dig too deep, until I landed where I had aimed from the moment I opened those old emails. An international audit firm known for shredding crooked companies to pieces. I'd built a reputation inside the firm as precise, ruthless, incorruptible. People joked that if Safia signed your books, they were truly clean. That morning, as I checked my reflection and pinned a small brooch at my shoulder, my phone buzzed with an email assigning my next major client. The name made my heart slam into my ribs. Carter Corp. The Carter Corp tower scraped at the sky, all glass and polished steel, as if trying to climb out of its own origins. I stepped out of the black sedan the firm provided and walked through the revolving doors, the click of my heels sharp against the marble floor. Security guards straightened unconsciously as I passed. The receptionist checked my ID twice, her polite smile tinged with nerves. Years of practice kept my expression cool. Inside the top-floor boardroom, they were already waiting. At the head of the long wooden table sat my father, a little older, a little grayer, but with the same greedy glint in his eyes. To his right, Susan's face looked unnaturally tight, stretched by expensive procedures and thick makeup. Luke lounged on the other side in a suit that tried and failed to make him look important. For a heartbeat, no one moved. I saw a tiny flicker of recognition, a tilt of my father's head, a brief frown from Susan, Luke's eyes narrowing as if something about me bothered him. But in their minds, Rachel Carter had died in a fire 5 years ago. The woman standing in front of them was too composed, too elegant, too confident to be the quiet, overlooked girl they had once ignored. I let a professional smile curl my lips and broke the silence. "Good morning, everyone," I said evenly. "I'm Safia, the lead auditor assigned by your investors. I'm here to make sure there isn't a single dollar unaccounted for in your books before you go public." My voice was lower and steadier than it had ever been as Rachel. It was a voice that made people sit up a little straighter. My father stood, laughing a touch too loudly as he reached across the table to shake my hand. "Ms. Safia, we've heard all about your work," he said, squeezing my fingers with practiced charm. "We're honored to have someone of your reputation here. Please sit. I assure you Carter Corp is completely transparent." Susan smiled thinly, her eyes flicking over my outfit and bag with a mix of appraisal and jealousy. Luke offered a lazy nod, twirling a pen between his fingers, pretending not to care. I clasped my father's hand firmly, meeting his eyes without flinching. His palm was damp and cold. "I hope that's true, Mr. Carter," I replied, tightening my grip just enough to make him wince. "Because if I find anything that doesn't add up, this IPO won't just be delayed. It'll be dead." The audit began that afternoon, and from the first day I made sure no one in that building slept easily. I demanded a separate room for my team, full access to their servers, and physical files brought up from dusty storage rooms. I arrived earlier than the staff and left later than the cleaning crew. I zeroed in on Luke, the CFO, with surgical precision. Every time he passed me a report, I red-penned it mercilessly, calling out inconsistencies and sloppy work in front of his subordinates. "This is amateur hour, Mr. Carter," I said once, sliding a marked-up balance sheet back to him. "Honestly, I'm surprised you graduated." His face flushed crimson in front of the junior accountants, but he didn't dare snap back. My opinion could make or break his shiny CFO title. The pressure chipped away at him day by day. All of this, though, was only the opening act. The real work began late at night, after everyone had left. I stayed behind on the pretext of catching up on paperwork, then quietly moved from the audit room to a locked office only a handful of people were supposed to access. My father's private workspace. Using a keycard I'd cloned and a few skills I'd picked up from too many hours reading about cybersecurity, I slipped inside. The office smelled faintly of his cologne. I plugged my own device into the network port beneath his desk, bypassed the surface-level accounts, and dug into the mirror of the cloud storage I'd broken into years before. My father was clever enough not to leave incriminating evidence on an obvious company server, but he was arrogant enough to keep trophies of his crimes hidden where he thought no one else could reach them. In a shadow ledger buried behind layers of encryption, I found a transfer of $500,000 labeled blandly as security consulting, dated the same day as my graduation. Tracing the account, I reached the name I already knew too well, the arsonist who died in prison years earlier. It was incriminating, but I needed more, a chain of proof that would stand up in court. That's when I remembered something else from that long-ago cloud dive. My father's obsession with backups. I searched for archived camera footage from the old house, the files the police had claimed were destroyed in the fire. After what felt like hours of combing through misnamed folders, I found one dusty file labeled Memories. It was corrupted. My hands were slick with sweat as I used recovery software I'd practiced with at the firm. A loading bar crawled across the screen. When it finally hit 100%, the video opened. The image was grainy, black and white, but clear enough. A hallway. The timestamp in the corner showed the morning of my graduation, a few hours before my family left for Bali. Susan walked into frame, younger by 5 years but unmistakable in her sharp suit and perfect hair. She carried a small plastic gasoline can, half hidden behind her expensive handbag. I watched as she stopped in front of my bedroom door, listened for movement, then bent down and poured a ribbon of liquid along the gap between the door and the floor. When she straightened, she pulled a small key from her pocket, slid it into the lock, and turned it twice. The sound of the lock clicking echoed through the quiet office so loudly I jumped. On the screen, she checked her reflection in a hallway mirror, adjusted a strand of hair, and walked away. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I had always assumed my father was the mastermind, that maybe Susan just went along with whatever he wanted. Seeing her calmly pouring fuel at my door, locking it from the outside, and straightening her hair afterward felt like being stabbed with an icicle. There was no hesitation, no remorse in her face. My mother, my stepmother, but still the woman who'd raised me, had personally sealed my bedroom into a coffin. Rage and grief rolled through me in waves, but underneath them was something steadier: clarity. I copied the video to 3 different encrypted drives and uploaded it to a secure server the firm didn't know I controlled. This was my trump card. I had finally found the match they had tried to strike. I wasn't going to light it just yet. The next morning, I walked into the boardroom with a small gift box wrapped in elegant paper. Susan arrived late, looking even more drawn than usual, and slid into her chair with a tired sigh. I smiled warmly and nudged the box toward her. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter," I said. "I saw something yesterday and it made me think of you. Just a little decoration for your new office, maybe." Her eyes brightened with vanity as she pulled off the ribbon. The second she lifted the lid, the color drained from her face. She gasped and nearly dropped the box. Inside, on a bed of white tissue, lay a small blackened padlock, an old model, the kind we'd once used on my bedroom door, its metal twisted and scorched as if it had survived a fire. "Is something wrong?" I asked pleasantly, tilting my head. Our eyes met, and for the first time I saw real fear in hers. She looked at me as though I were a ghost, and that was only the beginning. A few days later, a larger unmarked package arrived at the Carter house on a quiet Saturday afternoon. A housekeeper carried it into the living room where the family sat in strained silence. Luke, nursing his 3rd whiskey of the day, told her to open it. As soon as the box was cut open, the stench of charred fabric and gasoline filled the room. Inside was a black graduation gown, half-burned, edges crisped and crumbling into ash. Pinned neatly to the chest was a gleaming name tag: Rachel Carter, summa cum laude. Susan screamed, hurling a vase across the room and demanding that the thing be burned, buried, anything to make it disappear. She began calling every spiritual healer and exorcist she could find, smudging the house with incense and chanting prayers. They had wanted a ghost story to cover up a crime. Now they were being haunted by the truth. I knew all of this not because I'd suddenly gained supernatural powers, but because during a polite home visit a few days earlier, dropping off some documents they'd forgotten at the office, I had attached a tiny listening device under the living room coffee table. Back in my apartment, I curled up on the couch with my laptop and headphones, listening to them unravel. Susan's sobs, my father's angry attempts to rationalize, Luke's pacing and muttered curses, they all became a twisted soundtrack to my evenings. Susan's sleepless nights, my father installing more cameras and hiring guard dogs, the way they jumped at every creak of the floorboards, none of it would ever compensate for what they'd tried to do to me. But it was a start. For Luke, I reserved a different kind of torment. He had always tried to drown his conscience in alcohol and noise, so that's where I went to reach him. One night, I sat in a parked car across from an exclusive club, watching him stumble in, flanked by hangers-on. Hours later, he stumbled back out to the smoking area, sweat shining on his forehead, his shirt half unbuttoned. Music thumped through the walls. He fumbled for his phone, and that's when it vibrated with a new message from an unregistered number. On his screen, it looked exactly like my old one. I watched from my car as he read the text I'd scheduled. "My graduation isn't over yet, Luke. When are you coming to pick me up?" Even at a distance, I could see the way his body froze. He dropped the phone onto the table as if it had burned him, eyes scanning the crowd wildly as if I might be there among the dancers. By the time he staggered out to the curb and threw up in the gutter, the color had drained completely from his face. The following morning at the office, he looked like he hadn't slept at all. His hands trembled as he poured coffee, and the smell of stale whiskey clung to his suit. I asked for a private meeting under the pretense of clearing up sensitive discrepancies before I spoke to the board. Once we were alone in a small conference room with the door closed, I slid a red folder across the table toward him. "We need to talk about these transfers," I said. Inside were printed records of every account he'd siphoned money into over the last 2 years. Shell companies, secret cards, luxury cars bought in girlfriends' names. The total was staggering. Millions quietly bled from Carter Corp to feed his habits. His eyes darted page to page, then up to my face. "I can explain," he stammered. "It's just temporary. I was going to pay it back after the IPO bonus, I swear." I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. "Luke, this is corporate embezzlement on a massive scale. If I report this to the investors and the authorities, you're looking at years in prison. The IPO will implode, and your father will disown you for nearly sinking his darling company." He broke. The calm, arrogant CFO vanished, replaced by a sweaty, shaking man on the verge of tears. "Please," he whispered, "don't tell him. Don't tell them. I'll do anything. How much do you want? I'll pay you." I laughed softly, a sound with no warmth in it. "I don't need your pocket change," I said. "I make more than enough. But you're right. You can do something for me." I leaned forward until we were almost nose to nose. "You can give me your father." He stared, not understanding. I let the next sentence drop like a knife. "I know about the fire 5 years ago," I said quietly. "I know it wasn't an accident." His whole body jolted, as if a current had passed through him. He opened his mouth to deny it, but I raised a hand. "Don't bother. I've seen the insurance policy. I've seen the emails. I've seen what your mother did at my bedroom door." His lips moved around the word "my" before he caught himself. I pretended not to notice. "But the evidence I have isn't quite complete enough to nail your father as the mastermind rather than just a greedy opportunist. I need the rest. And lucky for you, I don't think you had the guts to come up with the idea on your own. That means I can paint you as the cowardly son, too weak to stop his parents, but not the architect. That's a story a judge might find interesting." He swallowed hard, torn between fear and a lifetime of loyalty built on fear. "It was his idea," he whispered at last, voice shredded. "Dad's. He said the company was finished, that the only way out was the insurance. Mom did what he asked. I was told to keep my mouth shut and enjoy the vacation." He squeezed his eyes shut, shame twisting his features. On the table between us, a tiny recording device I'd switched on before he came in captured every word. "Where does he keep proof?" I asked. He's too paranoid to rely only on emails. Luke hesitated. At home, he said finally. In a hidden safe behind a painting in his study. A little landscape over the sofa. There's a black notebook and a flash drive. He keeps a record of everything in case anyone he worked with tries to blackmail him. I nodded slowly, satisfaction humming under my skin. Here's what's going to happen, I said. Tonight, you're going to take those items and bring them to me. Tomorrow morning, you show up here with that notebook and that drive. If you do, I make your embezzlement disappear from my report. Try to cheat me, and I bury you and your father both. Your choice. In the end, his choice was as predictable as gravity. The gala to celebrate Carter Corp's impending IPO could have passed for a royal wedding. A 5-star ballroom in the heart of Jakarta glittered with crystal chandeliers and gold accents. Waiters wove between round tables bearing trays of champagne and tiny perfect appetizers. Investors, politicians, socialites, and journalists packed the room in black tie and designer gowns. On the stage, bathed in warm light, my family posed as the picture of success. My father in a tailored tuxedo, Susan in a silver gown encrusted with stones, Luke lurking just behind them in a dark suit, his smile slightly too stiff. Photographers' flashes popped like tiny lightning bolts. No one in that room knew that Luke had met me in a quiet cafe early that morning and slid a black notebook and a small flash drive across the table with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I arrived a little later wearing a deep burgundy evening dress and a black silk hijab that framed my face. Heads turned as I entered, not just because of the dress, but because people at events like this had learned my face. I was the Iron Lady, the auditor who could bless or curse a company with a signature. My firm had insisted I sit at the main VIP table, right in front of the stage. Under my clutch bag, resting on my lap, lay a slim tablet synced to the ballroom's audiovisual system, a system my team had quietly tested earlier under the guise of checking the investor presentation. They didn't know we'd left ourselves a back door. Around the edges of the room, a few extra hotel security guards had taken up positions near exits. In reality, they were police officers in plain clothes who had been very interested in the footage and documents I'd sent them. The evening unfolded like any other corporate celebration at first. Speeches from minor executives, stiff jokes from a government official, a glossy video about Carter Corp's journey from tragedy to triumph. Then it was my father's turn. The lights dimmed, leaving a single spotlight on him at the podium. He launched into a polished speech about resilience and innovation, his voice thick with rehearsed emotion. And then, on cue, he brought up my name. Tonight, he said, fingers tightening on the sides of the lectern, we dedicate this success to our beloved daughter, Rachel, whom we lost 5 years ago in a devastating house fire. Her spirit inspired us to keep going, to help others through the foundation we built in her name. He paused, dabbing at his eyes with a spotless handkerchief. In the audience, several people sniffed. Susan placed a hand dramatically over her heart. My thumb hovered over the tablet screen as I listened. When he said the words, "Foundation we built in her name," something in me clicked into place. I tapped the command I'd prepared. The giant LED screen behind him flickered. The slick stock graphics vanished, replaced for a moment by static. The crowd murmured. My father glanced over his shoulder, annoyed, and tapped his microphone, thinking it was a technical glitch. Then the first frame of the CCTV video appeared, blown up hundreds of times larger than when I'd first watched it in that dark office. Gasps erupted as Susan's younger self filled the screen, gasoline can in hand. The ballroom fell silent, so silent that the faint hiss of liquid hitting the floor seemed to echo as she poured it under my bedroom door. The timestamp glowed in the corner. The morning of the accident. On the stage, my father spun fully around, his face draining of color. Before he could shout for someone to shut it off, the video ended and the screen shifted to a scan of the life insurance policy in my name, the amount circled in red. Beside it, another screen appeared showing the ledger from the black notebook. Payments to the arsonist, notes about flames must fully destroy structure, the $500,000 consulting fee. The room exploded. Investors shot to their feet, shouting. Reporters grabbed cameras and rushed toward the stage. Some guests screamed. Others swore loudly. My father's hands flailed uselessly in the air as if he could wave the screens away. Susan collapsed into her chair, shaking her head over and over. Luke went completely white. From my seat at the front, I watched it all without moving. The security guards near the doors murmured instructions into hidden earpieces. Uniformed police began closing off the exits. My father, running on panic and instinct, jumped down from the stage and pushed through the nearest crowd, shoving anyone in his way as he aimed for a side door. He didn't get far. I stepped into his path midway down the aisle. For a moment, it felt like the world had shrunk to the two of us, the man who had tried to burn me alive and the woman he believed he had already buried. "Move," he snarled, sweat beading on his forehead. "You don't know what you're doing." He grabbed my arm to push me aside, but before the police moved, I lifted my free hand. "You really don't recognize me, do you?" I said softly. His grip faltered, confusion flickering in his eyes. Slowly, deliberately, I took my glasses off and slid them into my bag. Then I pulled a small makeup wipe from my clutch and pressed it along the side of my jaw, rubbing away the concealer that had hidden a small crescent-shaped birthmark since I started this plan. The mark bloomed on my skin, the same one he'd mocked when I was a teenager, calling it unlucky. His pupils dilated. I watched understanding crash over him like a wave. "Rachel," he breathed, the word torn out of him. "That's impossible. You're dead. You saw what you wanted to see." I cut in, my voice ice. "An empty house and a pile of ash you could trade for cash. I wasn't there, Dad. I was standing outside my graduation hall in the rain, waiting for a ride that never came." He shook his head, panic and anger fighting for space on his face. "You set me up," he spat. "You pretended to be someone else. You took my company. How could you do this to your own father?" The irony hit me so hard I almost laughed. "My own father?" I repeated. "My father is the man who insured his daughter for millions, hired an arsonist, and sent her stepmother to lock her bedroom door from the outside. The man who told the world I was the light of his life while he cashed in on my supposed death. You taught me, better than anyone, that money and reputation are everything. I just learned faster than you expected." He lunged at me then, hands reaching for my throat, but two officers were already there. They twisted his arms behind his back and snapped cold metal around his wrists. All around us, cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions as officers swarmed the stage to collect Susan, who had to be half-carried, half-dragged, sobbing that she didn't know what she was doing. Another group intercepted Luke as he tried to slip toward a side exit. He didn't resist, just sagged between them as if someone had cut his strings. As my father was pushed toward the door in handcuffs, he twisted his neck to look back at me one last time. "Why, Rachel?" he shouted over the noise, bitterness cracking his voice. "Why would you do this to your own family?" I stepped closer, just enough for him to hear me clearly, and let him see the satisfaction in my eyes. "Because I was the best investment you ever made," I said quietly. "You raised me to be smart and ruthless and to understand the value of a payoff. You just miscalculated. Tonight, your debt finally came due." The weeks and months that followed played out on screens and headlines across the country, but for me they passed in strange, quiet clarity. The police raids on Carter Corp's offices, the asset freezes, the shock statements from investors. All of it had been set in motion the moment I'd pressed play on that video. My father sat in interrogation rooms under harsh fluorescent lights, while detectives slid copies of his emails and ledgers across cold metal tables. The charm that had once wooed bankers and politicians crumbled under the weight of evidence. His usual lawyers refused the case, unwilling to tie their names to him. Susan landed in a women's prison, her complaints about the mattress and the food met with laughter or indifference. Luke found himself in a crowded cell, stripped of his title and his designer suits, pushed around by men who didn't care who his father had been. When the trial finally began, courthouse steps filled with protesters and rubberneckers. People were outraged that parents could conspire to kill their own child, that a family they'd admired had been built on that kind of rot. Sitting in the witness stand, facing the three of them across the courtroom, I felt oddly calm. I told my story plainly. Being left alone at graduation, the fire news at the station, the cloud account, the insurance, the years rebuilding myself. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. The defense tried to paint me as a bitter daughter exaggerating old wounds, but the videos and documents spoke louder than I ever could. At one point, our eyes met, mine and my father's, and I saw something in his expression that almost resembled pride, twisted into hatred. He'd spent his life teaching me that weakness was a sin. Now he was being destroyed by the strength he'd accidentally cultivated. In the end, the judge's gavel fell with a sound that felt like a door slamming shut on an entire era of my life. My father was sentenced to life in prison for attempted murder and large-scale insurance fraud. Susan received 20 years as the direct executor of the plan. Luke got 15 for conspiracy and corporate embezzlement. There was no mercy in the verdict, no suspended sentence, no loophole for wealth to slip through. The government seized their assets, houses, cars, shares, accounts, to compensate defrauded investors and cover fines. The Carter name, once whispered with envy at charity galas, became a punchline and a cautionary tale. They had locked my door and walked away 5 years ago. Now steel doors closed on them in turn. Prison turned out to be the only punishment harsh enough to match what they'd done. My father was placed in isolation after a failed attempt to bash his own head against a wall when he learned how much of his fortune had vanished. Alone in a narrow cell with peeling paint and a tiny barred window, he began talking to himself, reliving old deals and imaginary board meetings with people who were never coming back. His hair turned wholly white. The careful diet and personal trainers that had kept him vigorous were replaced by bland rice and thin soup. Susan, transplanted from luxury spas to a shared concrete cell, clawed at any scrap of control she could find. When her fellow inmates laughed at her demands for bottled water and air conditioning, she retreated inward, haunted by nightmares of fire and locked doors. Luke, the weakest of them, quickly learned that in prison money and family names meant little in the face of raw hierarchy. He bargained for protection by becoming a servant to harder men, doing their laundry, giving up his food, flinching at every raised voice. 6 months after the sentencing, on a morning washed in clear sunlight, I stood on the balcony of a new apartment overlooking the sea. The air smelled of salt instead of smoke. For the first time in years, my chest felt light. The last administrative threads of the case had finally been tied off. A court-approved transfer of funds from a special account, money the law recognized as restitution for the wrongful death of Rachel Carter. Legally, it was compensation for what had been done to me. In reality, it was the same money the insurance company had paid out after they thought I'd burned. Tens of millions of dollars now sitting in an account with my name on it. It would have been easy to use it as a golden ticket. Retire young, travel, buy the kinds of things my family had always worshipped. Instead, when I looked at the balance, all I could see was the price tag they'd put on my life. Using it for myself felt like agreeing with their math. I showered, dressed simply, and drove out of the city toward a quieter neighborhood where trees grew thick and kids played soccer in dusty yards. Tucked away on a side street was a small, clean complex with a simple sign, a home for children who'd been abused, abandoned, or left behind. I'd researched it carefully. The woman who ran it, a middle-aged director everyone called Mama, greeted me at the door with tired eyes and a real smile. In her office, while the sound of children's laughter drifted in through the window, I signed the paperwork that transferred every cent of that restitution into the home's account. Mama stared at the number more than once, as if she thought she'd misread it. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "With this, we can build proper dorms, a school, maybe even a clinic. We can take in so many more kids." I nodded. "I'm sure," I said. "Think of it as a gift from someone who knows exactly what it feels like to be treated as expendable. Make sure none of them ever feel like they're worth more dead than alive." As I signed, a weight I hadn't noticed I was still carrying lifted from my shoulders. The blood money that had nearly killed me had been turned into something else entirely. My father had tried to convert my life into cash. I had finally converted his greed into hope. The lineage of that money ended here. When I stepped back into the courtyard, the afternoon sun was warm and forgiving. My phone buzzed in my pocket, jarring me slightly from my thoughts. The name on the screen made me smile in spite of myself. Adrian. He was a senior colleague at the firm, one of the few people who had stood by me unquestioningly during the months of trial and media frenzy, making sure I ate when I got lost in work, offering quiet jokes when I looked like I might break. He'd never pushed for explanations I wasn't ready to give. "So," his voice came light and teasing when I answered, "are you still coming to dinner tonight, or did you bury yourself in spreadsheets again?" I laughed, a sound that didn't feel forced. I'm coming, I said. Text me the location. I'm finally free tonight. The word free tasted different now, less like escape, more like open space. Before I started the car, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back at me had the same crescent-shaped birthmark, the same eyes, but everything else was different. The way she held her head, the steadiness in her gaze, the absence of that old, pleading softness. Rachel had been a ghost clinging to people who wanted her gone. Safia was someone I'd built from the ground up, piece by painful piece. Leaving that graduation hall in the rain, walking away from the building where I'd waited for hours, that had been the first true decision of my life. If I'd gone home that night, my story would have ended in smoke and a line in a news script. By walking away, I discovered that family isn't always about blood, and worth is never defined by people too broken to see it. I rolled down the window as I pulled out onto the road, letting the warm wind rush in and tangle the edge of my scarf. I didn't look back at the home disappearing in the side mirror, or at the city skyline in the distance. The past was locked away now, literally and figuratively. Somewhere behind high walls and steel bars, 3 people were replaying their choices on an endless loop. I didn't need to replay mine. I'd made new ones. As the car merged into the flow of traffic, I whispered so quietly no one else could have heard, "Goodbye, Rachel." It felt less like erasing myself than like putting flowers on an old grave. Then I smiled, turned up the radio, and drove toward the promise of a simple dinner, real conversation, and a future that no longer smelled like smoke. And if you're still here, listening to how I walked out of a fire that was meant to kill me and built a life of my own, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and share this story. Somewhere out there, someone needs to hear that walking away from the people who try to break you might be the very thing that saves your life.